Hello.
I'm here, Bruce, but I can't hear anything either.
Okay. Ah. I see a message that says go ahead and start talking, Bruce. Jennifer, please confirm.
Hi, can anybody hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay, sorry about that. I don't know what happened there. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Restoration and Recovery for Amphibians and Reptiles webinar series. We're happy to have you here with us today. My name is Jen Williams. I'm the Federal Coordinator for Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation, and I also work within the Biological Resources Division in the National Park Service in Fort Collins, Colorado. There will be 2 breaks during the presentation for questions, and the presenters will let you know when those times are available. However, if you're interested in asking questions or making comments while they're talking, feel free to use the questions box on your control panel. If you just type your message, I will work with the speakers to get you a response during the 2 question breaks. And we are recording today, and we archive the recording on a National Park Service website, and it may also be on the Amphibian and Reptile Conservancy website. And I will also share the link in your inbox following the webinar. And anybody who is outside of the National Park Service, you'll have to email me directly to obtain a recording of the webinar. I have to send it out through a special file sharing service. So today's webinar features Bruce Kingsbury, who obtained his BA from Pomona College and his MS from San Diego State University and his PhD from the University of California, Riverside. He is currently a professor of biology at Purdue University in Fort Wayne, and he is Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. And he also directs the IPFW Environmental Resources Center. It sounds like Bruce stays very busy. Bruce's research focuses on the conservation and management of wildlife. He is an expert on a variety of reptiles, including the eastern Massasauga and copperbelly snake. Much of the research that he and his students conduct relate to habitat restoration and land management practices with the intention of improving outcomes for non-game species. Joanna Gibson obtained her BS from Central Queensland University and her MS from Purdue University, Fort Wayne. And from 2000 to 2010, Joanna worked at the Center for Reptile and Amphibian Conservation and Management, and it's now called the Environmental Resources Center at Purdue University, Fort Wayne, where she participated in research on amphibians and reptiles. It is during that period that she completed her MS research on effects of prescribed fire on a population of eastern box turtles. She is currently a senior environmental scientist or specialist with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife in the Inland Deserts region, where she is responsible for environmental review and permitting and review of mitigation banking, habitat conservation planning, as well as natural community conservation planning documents. Much of her work focuses on ensuring that appropriate and adequate environmental minimization and mitigation strategies are developed and implemented to offset impacts associated with development. And just to let you know, we've already had 1 webinar in this series that was focused on the northwestern U.S., and there will be 2 more webinars focusing on habitat management guidelines. We'll have the Northeast webinar in June, and then the Southeast in October. So again, please email me if you'd like some more information on those upcoming or past webinars. Take it away, Bruce and Joanna. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Jen, for that introduction, and thank you all for joining Joanna and I for our presentation today. to get started, we really want to extend our thanks to the Wildlife Conservation Branch and Biological Resources Division within the National Park Service for funding this endeavor and making it possible. As noted, this presentation is a production of PARC, Partners in Amphibian Reptile Conservation, and so to start off, I wanted to say a little bit about PARC. And here's the mission for PARC: to conserve amphibians, reptiles, and their habitats as integral parts of our ecosystem and culture throughout proactive and coordinated public-private partnerships. And the emphasis there is partnerships, and it's right in the name of the organization. So who is PARC? So it's a broad collaborative, including all of the 11 agencies that are relating to environmental issues. All 50 states are participating, and then there's a wide variety of NGOs, academics, private individuals, etc., that are also involved. And then in terms of what it is, it's many things, but mostly it's about the conversation and the collaboration to get everyone involved, to generate products that are useful for conservation of reptiles and amphibians. It's regionally organized. Here's a map showing the distribution of the regions for PARC, and there's the Midwest region highlighted, and so that's what we're going to focus on today in terms of the region. PARC produces a lot of very useful documents and other sorts of products. Here are two: the inventory and monitoring guidelines for herps, and then the habitat management guidelines series that we're going to be highlighting today. This afternoon, the strategy is going to be to start with talking about basic reptile and amphibian natural history, because in order to properly conserve these organisms, we really have to have some fundamental knowledge of their ecology and behavior. Then we're going to turn to the habitat management guides, focusing on a few of the habitat chapters. These are just examples. We could spend a day or several days going over the details that are throughout the HMG. And really what we're trying to do here is give you a taste and encourage you then to delve further into it. Nevertheless, even though we're just taking a sample, it'll take up the bulk of the presentation today. We've also thrown in a couple deeper dives, what we might call case studies, along the way to expand on the presentation. So to get started on some background, the Midwest has a fairly diverse array of amphibians and reptiles, and across that array we see that there's all kinds of life history strategies and adaptations to various sorts of environments. Not too many invasive species in the Midwest. Certainly other areas have had to deal with this far more than we have. Just a side note, research on the ecology, habitat management, and conservation of herps has lagged behind that for other taxonomic groups, but things are getting better. So some fundamental background on herps. So first of all, they are ectothermic. That is to say, they rely on external sources of heat, in contrast to endotherms like ourselves. Cold-blooded, to me, is really a misnomer, since they are often pretty warm, and if they have a choice, that's where they would prefer to be. Many reptiles, for example, like to be in the 80s or around 30 degrees Celsius. They can survive extended periods without eating because their metabolic requirements are very low because of ectothermy. And as a consequence, they can also devote a lot of their energy to growth and reproduction rather than just heat production. I would also note that reptiles are fairly resistant to water loss, but North American amphibians are not. Even species like toads, which some people think are somewhat resistant to water loss, really are lose water at the rate equivalent to a sponge. So they have to be able to get to moisture in some fashion in order to rehydrate. Herps are usually hidden and mostly solitary. Lots of other animals like to eat them, so they lay low. Nevertheless, some species can be quite abundant. Salamanders in many areas are likely the most abundant vertebrate. And in the Midwest, perhaps the most abundant snake is the brown snake, a little secretive snake that most people don't see. That said, they can be very concentrated at certain times, such as when breeding or hibernating, and this is something that we'll revisit later on in the presentation. They use a variety of habitats. It's really a mistake to think of their needs as being relatively simplistic, and the more you learn about the ecology of the animals, the more you realize that to be the case. A couple of examples would be mole salamanders, which spend the majority of their life well away from water and underground, but then they briefly leave those terrestrial habitats to breed in late winter or early spring before they go back to their forest environments. Turtles take the opposite path, traveling to terrestrial environments to lay their eggs. And Blanding's turtles may, for example, travel 1 kilometer or more, crossing roads and agricultural landscapes along the way. So a lot of moving around. And copperbelly water snakes and Blanding's turtles may visit multiple wetlands in a single day. Many of the species, particularly amphibians, have widely fluctuating populations. This is important because seeing a good year of amphibians may convince you that their populations are doing spectacularly well, and that actually might be true at the moment, but they do fluctuate up and down naturally over time, and when those populations are low, they might be particularly vulnerable to extirpation, and they need those banner years to make it through the bad years. And finally, herps are important both as predators and prey. They eat a lot of smaller things, but they are the food for a lot of other animals, and so they're critical in food web dynamics in many areas. Something I wanted to spend a little bit of time on as sort of a deeper dive was to think about life history a bit. It's important to understand that we cannot think of many species of reptile and amphibian, particularly reptiles, as having life histories that are like game species. And some of you may know a bit about Blanding's turtles and timber rattlesnakes as classic examples of this, but it's broadly true. And as a consequence, it's unrealistic to expect that populations that have suffered some kind of loss are going to be able to recover, and they may be at great risk. And so it's important not to try to think of managing them in the way we might think of managing deer or some other game species that has a fairly fast recovery. So to get into that a little bit further, I wanted to take a closer look at Blanding's turtles and to show you a little bit about what I'm talking about. So Blanding's turtles have a really delayed time to sexual maturity, and it takes the juveniles a long time to get up to adult size. Females may reach sexual maturity, depending on the population, in about 17 or 18 years, but that's fairly consistent across sites. And historically, anyway, adult survivorship was nearly 100% from year to year. So that's a very important point. Fortunately for them, the females keep on reproducing as long as they're alive. We're aware of older individuals that are very successful at continuing to reproduce. In order to nest, the females may travel substantial distances, which would potentially put the adults at risk. They might not breed every year, and when they do breed, they're only laying one clutch, and the clutch is about 10 eggs, give or take. So here's the problems. Animals like raccoons and opossums and skunks, etc., are very effective at depredating nests, and almost all of the nests are predated in the first day. Even hatchlings that make it are very small and vulnerable, and as a consequence, in most areas, in most years, recruitment is essentially zero. So in terms of management, it means that every adult is critical. Cumulative mortalities should not exceed 5%. And if you think about that 5%, then, and we talk about cumulative, you have to consider that that's going to include kills on roads, impacts from fire and other activities, and particularly collection. So population recovery is going to be very low, and recruitment rates, even in the best locations, are just barely enough to take care of adult losses. And for that reason, every effort should also be made to promote recruitment. So the last thing to talk about in this section is what we might call hot spots and hot times. Some of the habitats that the species may need may be relatively uncommon, and they may only be used at critical points in time. So when you're thinking about trying to protect the species, you need to think about what those critical habitats are and be very aware of when the animals are using them so that you might time your management manipulations. So gestation sites are fairly important. Here's a Massasauga that has just given birth to some babies, and they hang around together for about a week before they disperse. Nesting sites are another one. In this case, late spring is a critical time, and recall that turtles may travel quite a bit to get where they think they need to go. Here's a turtle nesting right next to a gravel road, so they're going to experience some vulnerability there. And then the last one of these, and I thought I'd spend just a moment longer on this one, is hibernacula. So these Massasaugas, as I've depicted here, and if you can see my pointer, and if you go up and look to the upper left-hand corner, there's a crayfish burrow that the snake has come out of, and there was a prescribed fire conducted in this area, and so you can see the blackened debris in the background. But the snake itself is chalky because of the calcareous soil that it just came out of. Now these animals are going to be quite safe when they're underground, but when they emerge, they're going to be concentrated and very vulnerable. And the suitable sites for this sort of thing are pretty restricted. And because they're restricted, the snakes may travel some distance to get there. For this particular instance, this hibernation happens in crayfish burrows, and the snakes actually hibernate underwater in these crayfish burrows. To get to such a site, the snakes may travel some distance. Here are some minimum convex polygons, which all have an apex over here in this one area, and that's where they actually are hibernating. And from there, then they disperse over a very large area. But if practices were conducted at the wrong time in an area that's essentially the size of a family house, then that would devastate that population. Here's some minimum convex polygons coming out of localities from timber rattlesnake hibernacula, same kind of pattern. So it's important to keep these sorts of things in mind. Now, to kind of close on this, I point out some temperature data over a spring period for Massasaugas, where we have temperatures at different depths, and we have a flip in the temperatures in terms of how deep they are in the soil. That happens early in the spring, and then the red lines are when the snakes are coming out of the ground. If fire or other manipulations are conducted before those snakes emerge, then they're going to be safe. However, if the fire is conducted in that area a week or two later, then that population is going to be impacted. So the timing is very important. So conservation and challenges for amphibians and reptiles are extensive. We have them listed here. Of course, we're going to be focusing on habitat and also on management. And so within the notion of habitat loss, alteration, and fragmentation, there's outright habitat removal, there's degradation from succession, invasion from non-natives, fragmentation, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the big concerns that we have about habitat loss and the many ways that such occurs. All right, so with that, this is going to be the end of our first section. I do want to highlight that there are a variety of PARC tools that are available. They're listed there. That's just to sort of suggest to you what's out there. If you go to PARC Place, you can take a look at what's really there. And also, there's a handout that's associated with this talk that will be provided, and that has a lot of other resources. So at this point, I will turn it over and see what kind of questions we have.
Bruce, we did receive one comment, and somebody had said that the inventory and monitoring book is not available, and that is correct. We're currently out of hard copy supplies, but we are prepping to get another print run done, and so please email me at jen_williams@nps.gov if you'd like a copy, and we can get that added to our pre-order. Please indicate the number of copies and how you plan on paying for it. One question is, can you comment on indirect effects of fire, such as increases in predation by hawks, etc., and the importance of leaving unburned patches?
Sure, that's a great question. As a little foreshadowing, I'll note that towards the end of the presentation, I'll spend a little bit more time on fire because I think it's a very important one to talk about. I am an advocate for incomplete burning. That is to say that a patchy fire is definitely advantageous. There is a lot of information now available in terms of recommendations for how to do burns. And if you go to the Midwest PARC site, there actually is a white paper there that you might consider to be valuable. I think we don't have time to delve too much into these details, but I think it's really quite important that people be very considerate of the pros and cons of fire.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. And another question we have is, does PARC get involved with conservation easements?
Does PARC get involved with conservation? I think, well, let me answer that question in one way, which I hope is perhaps the way it was intended, is PARC is a consortium of a bunch of partners, and within that array of partners, what we certainly hope is that anybody who's interested in developing easements or looking for guidance on what to do on easements or prioritizing areas that should have easements, that I hope that such help would be available. Certainly I would be quite happy to try to be helpful in that way. But one of the things we encourage is to identify folks that are in your area that can try to be helpful that way.
Okay, that's all the questions for now, if you want to resume the rest of the presentation.
All right, so now we're going to transition over to Joanna.
I think I've taken control. Are you seeing this slide now? The next one?
Yep, you got it.
Okay. All right, so the guidelines themselves were developed for each PARC region, and you can see the Midwest highlighted here. But as we know, species and habitats don't follow state boundaries. So the members may also associate with regions outside of their geographic location. For example, Nebraska here, they could end up with working with the Midwest PARC group, also bleeding in here into the Northwest PARC group, and also down into the Southwest PARC group. The guidelines outline management principles and specific activities that can be implemented by land managers to help keep common species common, stem the decline of imperiled species, guide habitat restoration efforts for the benefit of amphibians and reptiles, and reduce the likelihood that additional species will be added to the endangered species list. We've added a link at the bottom of the screen here for you to acquire a free hard copy or a PDF, and this information is also provided on the handout. So the habitat sections covered includes 2 sets of management guidelines, maximizing compatibility and ideal. Maximizing compatibility are targeted towards the conservation and stewardship of amphibians and reptiles while managing lands primarily for other uses. And the ideal guidelines focus on management activities where amphibian and reptile conservation is the primary objective. So where there is an interest in implementing management activities for the benefit of reptiles and amphibians, the first step is information gathering and the development of a management plan. So it's good to start out by conducting an inventory of the habitat types and map their locations and sizes in the landscape. If funding and staffing is limited, species surveys can't be completed, you could consider cross-referencing your habitat types with Appendix B of the guidelines. And the Appendix B provides a matrix of amphibian and reptile species occurrence by habitat type. Once you have this information gathered, it's easier to identify areas that need restoration or other management actions that would benefit amphibians and reptiles. You also want to pay attention to current habitat conditions, such as the presence of invasive plants or other species. And if other land uses are your primary focus, then you can identify ways to do management compatibility between your land use goals and habitat suitability for amphibians and reptiles. So one of the most important first steps is to obtain maps and imagery of your lands, and luckily those resources are now easily sourced and they're typically free of charge. So aerial imagery will allow for the visualization of the arrangement of certain habitats and can help locate important habitats within the landscape. And that can assist you in planning buffers along waterways or constructing artificial wetlands, corridors between disconnected habitats, and perhaps the reintroduction of natural fire regimes, knowing where to target those activities. A really good tool is comparing current aerial photographs with older images. and you can get a historical perspective of what the habitat used to look like. And you'll quite often find that there's going to be compatibility with the management objectives that you'd like to pursue with other wildlife and management goals. We encourage collaborating with experts. Management plans will benefit from the insights of experienced local or regional biologists. And of course, periodic monitoring of amphibian and reptile populations and habitat quality will help you gauge whether or not any management actions you implement have achieved their desired effects. So the habitat management guidelines themselves include 13 habitat modules, and for today's talk we'll be covering 2 aquatic habitat types and 2 terrestrial, and they're bolded here on the list. For seasonal wetlands, the first step in the management of these habitats is to identify where they are in the landscape. It can be difficult to identify where they are when they're dry, so the best time to look is in winter and spring where water pools in the landscape. Consider protecting those areas in place. Let them stay seasonal. Widening or deepening them may eliminate their use by amphibians and reptiles. If deeper ponds are needed, it's best to consider building them away from these natural habitats. Larger open water wetlands, particularly those that may hold water for several years between drying cycles, are tempting targets for stocking with fish. However, the presence of fish reduces or eliminates reproductive success for many amphibians, so we discourage that. And maintaining natural habitat around wetlands is important. Species often spend the majority of the season outside those areas, and they only visit the wetland itself for reproduction. So the immediate surrounding habitat of wetlands is really important. The shoreline structure provides habitat for breeding, foraging, or refuge, and it also, the corridors themselves and the buffer area out there around the wetlands safe provide areas for movement between and out of the wetland. The amphibians need to be constantly moist, so maintaining native vegetation around wetlands will help minimize mortality due to desiccation, and will also provide suitable habitat for their invertebrate prey base. You can also consider restoring or creating wetlands where they have been degraded or destroyed. It's a good idea to consider constructing or restoring or creating wetlands in a series on the landscape, because that can help facilitate dispersal and accelerate recolonization. And it might not just be the amphibians and reptiles themselves that would benefit from these activities. Waterfowl they would also benefit from such activities. It's important to consider seasonal timing, as Bruce mentioned earlier, to reduce conflicts with animals when they're active. For example, if you need to conduct mechanical vegetation management activities, it's important to do so outside of those periods when adults and juvenile migrations are occurring, because that could result in high mortality rates. Limiting the number of roads in the vicinity of seasonal wetlands, or and locating new roads or rerouting them away from these areas is important to reduce mortality. And in areas where livestock may be in the same area, livestock can destroy habitat and negatively impact water quality, so consider fencing livestock out of at least some of the wetlands, or locate watering facilities away from wetlands. Under ideal situations, there may be the potential to create or restore wetlands. So if you consider the historical landscape that the embedded seasonal wetlands were once existed in, you could use aerial photography, look at historic compared to recent, and you may be able to identify, based on shading in the aerial photography, where old wetlands were previously before they were removed. So you can consider restoring those by plugging ditches or removing fill. We advocate to consider a range of management options before using chemicals, for example fire, as long as the timing is suitable. Existing wetlands can be enhanced for native species, so remove or control invasives that may occur there, and that includes invasive plants, because they can choke and areas to the point where they can't support amphibians and reptiles. And as Bruce mentioned previously, raccoons can have a tremendous toll on turtle nesting areas, so controlling subsidized predators will also benefit amphibians and reptiles. So here's a list of species that would benefit from management actions in seasonal wetlands. This is within the Midwest, so you can see there's quite a few species that would benefit. Now I wanted to go through a couple of examples of wetland restoration creation efforts, and this is a before and after, and then before and after on the other side of the screen. So the examples provided on this slide and the next one that we'll see use techniques outlined in Tom Biebighauser's A Guide to Creating Vernal Pools. These two examples on this slide were completed on the Hoosier National Forest in southern Indiana and on decommissioned roads. In both examples, the roads were permanently closed and the area was shaped with a narrow blade using a low ground pressure dozer. Sites were seeded with native species and mulch. And then for the effort, the staff from the Hoosier National Forest were able to create 20 pools along an abandoned roadbed in only 3 days. And the lower image over here, this picture was actually taken only 4 months after construction of the wetlands, and you can still see some turbidity in the water. And the one on the right was taken 14 months post-construction. Here's an example of a seasonal wetland being created that required more intensive effort than the previous examples we were looking at. So in this example, the site was cleared of trees and the trees are put to one side and saved. Topsoil was removed, and again that was stockpiled and saved. And a core trench was dug and filled with clay, and then the area was compacted. Topsoil was redistributed, vegetation was placed back in and around the wetland, and the sites were seeded and mulched. And these two examples on the screen follow those techniques I just mentioned. This lower wetland here on the left-hand side was built in 2009 on the Mark Twain National Forest in Missouri, and total construction costs were only $800, so you can create these wetlands quite cheaply. We're going to go through quickly a case study by John Palis. He looked at amphibian and reptile colonization of constructed wetlands in southern Illinois. The site is the Nature Conservancy's Grassy Slough Preserve. It's just shy of a 3,000-acre former vegetable farm. The land was retired from commodity production, and wetlands were constructed on the site by impounding water behind short earthen dams. The surrounding uplands were planted with bottomland forest trees, particularly oaks. And the study focused on 3 wetlands out of the 15, with surveys completed prior to wetland construction and after wetland construction. So you can see that 1 year after construction, 22 species of amphibians and reptiles had colonized the 3 wetlands, and by the end of the 3-year study, there were a total of 35 species. You can see for wetlands, each of the 3 wetlands looked at are listed here. And in each case, the number of amphibians and reptile species detected increased over time. Another good paper, which includes a synthesis of peer-reviewed literature on amphibian use of created and restored wetlands, is Brown et al. 2012, and we've provided a link to download that paper in the handout. For rivers and large streams, alteration of flow or temperature regimes can have negative impacts on downstream resources. Discharges from dams should be scheduled to coincide with natural flooding cycles. And during periods of drought, it's important that bypass discharges occur to maintain in-stream flow. If the application of chemicals such as pesticides is necessary, it's important that they are applied to the minimum area needing treatment, that all label directions are followed, that you follow rules and regulations that may be pertinent to the state that you're in, and make sure that there is an adequate buffer around the streams and wetlands. Restoration of impaired riverbanks will facilitate wildlife movement to floodplains and upland nesting areas. Suitable nesting habitat along riverbanks may be limiting in the landscape, and these areas can be adversely impacted by excessive recreational activities. So to protect those areas, consider restricting public access. Woody and rocky structure provide important shelter, basking, and other microhabitat for amphibians and reptiles. So if management of those features is necessary, it's important to limit those management activities to the smallest areas possible. Providing conservation-related education materials to recreation visitors is a good idea. Users of those areas then will likely know the problems and potential solutions, and I think most people would welcome some useful materials. Routing roads to avoid floodplains and nesting areas is important. As we mentioned previously, road mortality can be very high when roads are placed in the vicinity of these areas. Vegetation cover along riverbanks provides habitat for many species of amphibians and reptiles, and similarly, upland buffers are important for movement. So these areas should be protected, enhanced, and restored. Sandbars and other open habitats in and along rivers provide basking sites and, most importantly, nesting sites for turtles. So allowing natural formation of those elements will also enhance natural ecological processes in the river and benefit many other species. Coarse woody materials, banks, and rocky structures are used as basking sites by snakes and turtles. These species would benefit by allowing natural buildup of surfaces. It's important to seek ways to improve water quality, minimizing or eliminating sources of pollution, and avoiding bank modification is really important. Unnatural objects around the shoreline inhibit the use of these areas and interfere with movements into and out of the water. Riprap in particular is problematic because it can trap animals. Again, we have a large list of species that would benefit from management actions in rivers and large streams. For grasslands and prairies, where mowing and haying are goals, timing is important. It's important to limit them to the least active periods. Also, mowing at high blade heights, 8 inches or greater, will reduce reptile injury and mortality. And using mowing systems that don't create suction will also help minimize mortality. Use of heavy machinery can rut and compact soils and kill reptiles and amphibians, so it's important to restrict the use of those techniques to fall and winter. Identifying and protecting embedded habitats such as seasonal wetlands, bogs, fens, streams, springs, seeps, and rock outcrops is important within larger habitat complexes such as grasslands and prairies. The microhabitats are important for breeding, foraging, and high vernacular, and without these areas, herp biodiversity will not be as great. It's important to provide aquatic connectivity. So if there's culverts in the area underneath roads, they need to be properly designed and as large as possible and placed such that amphibians and reptiles can enter and exit them easily. Maintaining or restoring natural habitat conditions in terms of species diversity and spatial variability. Removing non-native species, controlling woody encroachment and woody succession is important. And keeping in mind that reptiles and amphibians can move great distances between habitats to fulfill their needs. So maintaining and restoring natural corridors between habitats will minimize mortality due to predation and desiccation. Restoring the natural fire frequency, intensity, and seasonality is a great idea where it's appropriate. If fire is not possible, a good option is controlled grazing, especially by herbivores such as goats and bison. And leaving habitat structure in place such as rocks, brush piles, and other woody materials will provide important habitat and refuge sites for amphibians and reptiles. Again, we have a species list for species that are found in grasslands and prairies in the Midwest that would benefit from management activities in those habitats. Okay, I'm going to go a little bit faster because we are running out of time. But in rock outcrops, glades, and talus, it's important that rock climbing and other recreational activities are placed well away from biologically significant areas. Around these areas, management of invasive species and shrubs is also important. If those areas were historically dry, plants may need to be removed to restore direct sunlight. However, if those areas were historically moist, you need to take care to keep the site shaded. So it's going to be some in-depth knowledge of the site will help a long way to deciding on what management techniques would be appropriate. Protecting the predominant habitat that surrounds rock outcrops allows for the dispersal of amphibians and reptiles to foraging areas and other sites. Hibernating reptiles and rock-dwelling salamanders usually spend only a part of their annual cycles in these areas. So providing safe passage to areas adjacent habitats is very important. Routing hiking trails around rock outcrops and talus zones and rerouting existing trails may be necessary to protect these habitats. Hibernating snakes and dense colonies of salamanders are extremely vulnerable to collecting or killing because they are concentrated in small areas. We've touched on this earlier. So it may be necessary to minimize publicity of these areas to avoid poaching or indiscriminate killing. It's important to monitor the long-term condition of these sites and ensure that if management activities are needed, they're implemented to enhance those areas. And here we have another list of the species that occupy rock outcrops, glades, and talus that would benefit from management activities. Okay, if there's any questions.
I don't see any right now, but we'll see if any pop up. But I was wondering if you could clarify, you had mentioned not using mowers, like suction mowers or something like that. Can you provide a little bit of clarification on that?
Yeah, some mowers, if they're low to the ground, can create a suction, so animals can be pulled up and into them. So if the mowing height is raised, the suction doesn't occur. Okay, thank you.
All right. Well, to go for the last piece here, I wanted to speak a little bit about conflicting priorities. There are a variety of them. Of course, property managers are faced with multiple objectives, and one of the challenging parts of their job is to figure out what to do about that. But there are a few that come up a lot. Fire is one very important tool for managing woody vegetation. A crucial thing with respect to fire is to consider the timing of it and understand how that's going to affect amphibians and reptiles. And in a moment, I'll talk a little bit more about that. Recreational activities are important in one part because if there are sensitive areas and hiking opportunities immediately adjacent to them or camping right in the middle of them, then that can cause some problems. The open canopy of some of these areas may be a draw for animals, and consequently, for either of these reasons, you might have an increase in human and wildlife conflicts. Another factor to consider is information made available to the public in terms of, especially in terms of sensitive areas. When animals are concentrated around hibernacula, for example, poachers are happy to reduce their overall level of effort by just working that. And of course, if anything that's popular gets loved to death. All right. So so really to wrap things up today, what I wanted to talk about was prescribed fire and species recovery, and sort of take the good and the bad approach. And first I wanted to talk about some of the work of Jennifer Neuwald, Alan Templeton, and others on the eastern collared lizard, and I really appreciate Jennifer's sharing of most of the content that I'm showing you now. So in the glades environment where this work was conducted, tree cores would suggest that fires had been occurring on roughly 5-year intervals for some time, and then as the areas became occupied and fire suppression became perfected, the glades became smaller and smaller over time, and ultimately led to the disappearance of the lizards. And here in this figure to the left, we see the extent of the glades in 1956, and then the extent of the glades in 1993. Quite a bit of the area had been lost. And so an effort was made to reintroduce the lizards to the system, and so some glades were burnt and lizards reintroduced to them, but the lizards did not disperse as was hoped from those areas. And so what was done was to switch strategy to not only burn the glades themselves, but actually burn the adjacent area. And the outcome of that was that the habitat in between the glades became more open. So going from something like this to something like that, and there were some very fantastic outcomes from that. They started to see the colonization of new glades, and as the fire strategy expanded, more and more glades were occupied, to the point that many of the glades on Steagle Mountain now had the lizards on them. So that was great. In fact, as things expanded, we even had the expansion of the populations onto adjacent ranges in their glade systems. So clearly an example of a very successful effort to help out a species. So then I want to contrast that with some work that actually is Joanna's research, and talk about box turtles, fire, and cumulative effects. So just remember that these threats that we're talking about come from all sides for something like a turtle, and fire is an additional factor to consider. So under typical fire regimes, what we found was that in areas where animals were being tracked and where fires were occurring in the spring, we were having 10 to 20% mortality. And furthermore, any of the turtles that were found incidentally in the area also had similar levels of injury. And not to dwell on it too much, but the injuries may not be immediately apparent, and they might take months to resolve one way or the other. And these sorts of injuries can involve different sorts of types, but they're substantial. And just to ride along for a moment with one turtle that experienced this, here's the turtle in May of 2006, and then progressing through the burn season in 2007. And you can see the red blemishes where the turtle has been injured, although by and large it kind of looks like everything's okay. But over time, the tissue falls off. You can see also on the leg that it's recovering from burns there. And here's a view from the back. And this turtle is actually okay, and it was going to be fine, except then it got burned again. And then the tissue loss was much more extensive, and that turtle ultimately died. So here's the deal. Because of some of the the elements that I've talked about already, this is a problem because the turtles are long-lived. They have to live for many years. So we want to see nearly 100% survival from year to year. They take a long time to reach maturity, and there's very poor recruitment. And the bottom line on something like this is that if the turtles don't show high levels of survival from year to year, then the populations are simply not going to persist. And it might take a little while, but you're going to get local extirpation of that species. So to finish, a little piece on regulations regarding herps, and here we're talking about since we're targeting national parks for one today, on federal properties, what you might not be aware of is that doing things like carrying a snake hook around, using enhanced ways of looking around at night, such as supplemental illumination, flipping logs, that sort of thing, all that's illegal. And you're not even to pick things up and take them back to camp to set up your picture. So all of this comes under the Lacey Act, and so this is something for not only visitors but also land managers to understand. So with all that considered, what is allowed? Well, that would be if you come upon a species of interest, then take a picture without disturbing it, and then you've managed to avoid all of the federal infringements that you might have otherwise. So with that, we're done. And I want to thank you very much for listening and invite another round of questions.
There aren't any posted right now, but we can, you know, wait a minute here, a few minutes, and see if any pop up. But I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us today, and especially to Bruce and Joanna for taking the time to share their expertise on amphibian and reptile conservation and management. I thoroughly enjoyed the webinar, and I hope everybody else did. I learned a lot from it.
Thank you.
Oh, you have some, thank you, Bruce and Joanna, from Tom Crone. Great presentation from David Pilliard. And is there a paper published on box turtles and fire? That's a question for you.
Well, there are the embarrassed side of the answer to that is not quite yet. We have some in progress. I can get anyone who wants it a PDF of Joanna's thesis, and also we have Christopher Woodley continued that work, and I can also provide that. We are working on several things out of that. One is just some of the thermal ecology. We're also working on some of the effects of fire that I spoke about today, and also we're developing predictive models to help managers understand when it's likely that the animals are going to come out from hibernation.
Laura, there's also a publication on the Midwest Park site, which is www.mwparc.org. And if you look under products, then under fire, there's a prescribed burning guidelines for amphibians and reptiles document up there that you're welcome to grab off of there. And it says, we have recently, here's another question for you, Bruce. We have recently, and Joanna, we have recently started burning in the September to November period for pollinator habitat improvement. Is this a conflict for herps?
Well, I'll comment and then invite Joanna to follow up. What I want to start with is we need so much work done on understanding fire that we need an active research program to actually understand these sorts of things. In order to really answer that question, I would need to know about where this was being done, and harkening back to something that Joanna pointed out is that we really need to know what species are present and what their particulars are in order to give the best answer to that. I do advocate that we think more flexibly about burns that are not in the traditional window that's so narrow in the spring.
Okay, thank you. And we have one more question. It says, how would you characterize the difference between core versus buffer zones around habitats, and is it species specific?
Great question. One of the things that that I have advocated for, and certainly would give a great nod to Ray Semlich for his groundbreaking work on this too, is that a lot of these species that we're talking about, if we're talking about wetlands, for example, from a jurisdictional rulemaking sort of perspective, the areas around wetlands might be buffered in order to consider preservation of water quality, but those areas are core habitat for the salamanders and the breeding turtles and other wildlife around those. And so you actually need not only to factor in the terrestrial component of core, then you need to buffer on top of that. I do think that that's going to vary from species to species, but certainly it's very easy to argue that 100 meters around wetlands is core habitat, and any such dimensions that are actually occur between wetlands that help the wetlands form wetland complexes that are diverse and numerous are also core habitat.
Okay, and somebody had asked for the website for the habitat management guidelines. I put the link for the Midwest PARC site in the chat area, so feel free to go there and grab it. We have another question that says, do you think that the prescribed fires are burning in the wrong season, and do you think wildfires caused similar mortality?
Well, I think what we're able to do now is do a better job of letting land managers know when the animals are actually coming out. They still have the challenge of making the decisions of trying to balance all of their management objectives. It is extremely challenging for spring burns because by the time conditions are really ready for a good burn, a lot of critters are out there. That's a challenge. I would say again that I think we need to look at warmer season burns and fall burns as alternatives so that we really fully understand the repertoire of times that are available for the land manager to use that tool.
Okay, and we have another question that says, where can I find a list of upcoming webinars? I can email that to you. We don't have specific dates set up, but the Northeast one is going to be in June and the Southeast one will be in October. We have to plan closer to the time just due to the number of presenters who participate and, you know, just conflicting schedules and everything. So I don't see any other questions. Oh wait, here's another one. Is it possible that focusing on the impacts of fire on the individual will lead to a different conclusion than a focus on the population? That is, might the best management for the population not be the one that results in the least incidental mortality?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think the answer is yes. That if we are taking a long-term strategy from the individual species or the multi-species perspective, that might be that some mortality actually leads to a long-term benefit. I think the caution is to actually understand the real meaning of that, and that the danger is that we may, without really understanding how severe the impacts are, tell ourselves that the effects are minimal. And I've certainly been in habitat where the habitat looks great and the species are not there. And so the potential for fire to be detrimental is substantial, just as the potential for it to be very useful is also substantial.
Okay, I'll scroll through these one more time. And I think that's it. So thank you everybody for attending, and again, special thank you to Bruce and Joanna. That was a really great presentation.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.